Did you miss me? That's right. It is another episode of the 5280 podcast. It is just the two of us. It is Cameron, myself, and Gage, host of the Broncos Syndicate over there on YouTube, as well as a co-host along with myself for the 5280 podcast. It is the younglings on the show here tonight. Glenn is out, and I think he's partying. What do you say, down in Florida? Is that right? I think he's down.
Oh no, he's in Disneyland.
That's right. He's in Disneyland, and Mike, I have no idea. I knew he was in Texas. Now I have no idea where he is. I think I kind of lost track from where he is. I want to still say he's in Texas, but you really can never be so sure with Mike.
If not, it's something to do with his kids.
That's right. That is absolutely right. Thank you guys so much for hopping in with us. It is that time of the off season where, look, we would have loved to have produced, content for you guys, for these last couple weeks, but it is those doldrums of the off season where there is some stuff going on, but there isn't really an overbearing of stuff that is going on. But the good news is we will get you all caught up on a lot of the stuff that happened within the week, or one of the stuff that has happened within the week. But it is certainly great to be back on with you guys over here on the MHRT Network and the 5280 podcast. And it is the definition of dead season. Absolutely sports nonsense. It is the definition of dead season. But Gage, what's new with you, man? I mean, how have you spent your dead season so far?
Honestly, just work. I've taken a little period off from content creation just for the sheer lack of stuff to talk about. I'm kind of trying to stack up some of those evergreen stories, I call them, that I can talk about them a week or 2 weeks after they've happened and they can still be relevant. That's how we're going to get through these next few weeks. Film studies, I've got a couple of those planned. It's going to be a really, really tough next 3.5 weeks, but we finally got some dates in terms of training camp. So at least we've got a definitive date for when this dry period of news is going to end. And we will finally be able to get an in-person look at the Denver Broncos, at Bo Nix. I'm super excited for that, but these 4 weeks are going to be hell.
And as you can clearly tell, there has been some changes on the podcast. One thing is for sure, there's no green screen anymore for Gage. He's very clearly, built up the back of his portfolio, I guess you could say, like the back end of his screen behind him. It looks, clean, and I'm sure you guys have seen it all over Broncos Syndicate. It looks incredible.
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh,
this is the first content piece that has debuted the new sign. We got a new company sponsoring Broncos Syndicate, so. Yeah, man, it's going to be really, really awesome working with them. And hopefully the fans see this and they want to cop one for themselves. He's also made one of the current Broncos logo, but when given the option, I had to get this throwback D, man. It's so sweet.
You actually received the classic throwback of Broncos D faster than the Broncos have, released their throwback uniforms on the store. I mean, give the people what they want. I mean, man, like give the people what they want. Let's put those throwback uniforms on the website. Let's get those credit cards moving and get some throwback uniforms. That's kind of like what I'm at. Like I am dying for that throwback uniform at this point. Reminder to everybody, make sure you hit that subscribe button to the MHRT Network. Follow Gage and I, as you can see here, Cameron Parker PO, Gage Madrid NFL. Let's get the news rolling first. Now, granted, there wasn't a lot of news that was rolling in. You teased, obviously, the big one, which has been the training camp dates, and actually that was released today. And I want to say it's the 26th, 27th, and 28th. I believe they do the back together weekend. It's something they've always done, which is the back together weekend. And then they do, the 2 other days. And actually, from what I gathered, is that they have the third most public practices, right, of any of the NFL teams, which you love to see that. So as much speculation, we'll just lead off with that. As much speculation as we thought there was going to be, that how are they going to handle the training camp this year, give new facilities that they could be running in. Not the case. They're going to have quite a bit of some open practices for fans.
16 of them, man. That's going to be really, really awesome. Plenty of opportunities. I know that obviously some people can't come out on weekdays. They can only come out on weekends. So they'll have ample opportunities to do that. The joint practices with Green Bay, or one practice, it's going to be open to the public. So that's going to be really, really awesome. If you're only going to be able to attend one day, I'd probably say that's the day, because that's the day that you can really get an idea of how the team is against somebody who's not their own color,
That's right.
They've been hitting each other for 2.5 weeks previous to this. They're sick and tired of it. They want to hit somebody else. So you can get a real judgment of really a lot of things that will go into the regular season with these joint practices. Randy Gregory, his temperament issues in that joint practice against the Dallas Cowboys, that was the last one that was open to the public. He ended up obviously having some of those same temperament issues in 2022. Then in 2023, the Broncos had some sloppiness in their joint practice against the Los Angeles Rams, and that ended up carrying over into the season. So that's one area that I'm really, really looking forward to when it comes to training camp. Also, obviously, that back together weekend. If you guys have kids, that'd be a good time to bring them out, because they'll no doubt have like Miles out there, face painting, all kinds of cool stuff, probably autographs from alumni. So they really do go all out at Dove Valley to enhance the fan experience. And this year is probably going to be the last year where it's going to be a little bit more normal for at least the next couple of years, because of the renovations that are going to happen out there at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. But this is going to be a real good way to kind of send that berm out and really dive into a really awesome training camp experience.
What's going on, D-Rock? Nice to have you. Oh, who's this in the? Who's this?
Oh, who's this dude? Get him out of here.
Oh, yeah. We don't need to read this comment. Anyway, but as far as
show up and we'll read your stuff, Mike.
That's right. But as far as training camp is concerned, like I think you're always kind of curious to see how the team always plays, and with training camp. I mean, I think for me, especially when it's the coaching staff and it's the same coaching staff, I'm curious to see how things change, stay the same, and maybe this is something that you and I have had the conversation about, at times before, but it's, given the fact that Sean Payton is here, and this is now truly like the definition of his team and truly what it feels like. And there definitely feels like there's some optimism in the sense that this is truly his team. Doesn't necessarily result in wins and losses, but you really do get that sense. I'm curious to see how tight, how loose he will run that ship, because that was really a big thing with training camp. You're not necessarily 2 minutes, over in terms of the whistle before you have to change stations, right? And so, I mean, it was just like he was almost like right to the point and right to the time that, okay, it's time to go to your next station. So I'm curious to see how lenient or how strict he'll still be, with those training camp, and especially when it comes to the rookie quarterback and that whole situation, and particularly the quarterback situation. How much grace will be applied for this kind of quarterback room. And I know that a lot of people are going to be splitting hairs and, are making a huge deal about that. But, your quarterback room is your quarterback room, and what you choose to do with your quarterback room is what you choose to do with your quarterback room. It's not our business to say about that. So I'm very curious to see what he's going to be doing and handling that whole training camp this particular year versus last year.
Based on the way New Orleans media talks, Sean Payton is very consistent in the way that he structures his practices. Just, you're going to get to your station at this exact time, just like how he structures, going out of the tunnel on game day. It's all to the exact minute. And that just, I feel like, is what Sean is comfortable with. If something were to break routine for Sean, I feel like he would kind of split hairs a little bit, and it just would make him uncomfortable. So just in that sense, I think those are going to stay the same. But how lenient he's going to be with the quarterbacks in terms of, if maybe Bo Nix goes out there, maybe he struggles a little bit with first-team reps. Will he be a little bit more hesitant to continue to give Bo Nix those first-team reps? That's going to be a very interesting thing to monitor. I'm hoping he gives Bo a relatively long leash, because Bo, there's nothing that really he could lose by throwing some interceptions in practice. And there's only things he can gain from that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I just, the reason why I bring up maybe lenient is maybe he goes a couple extra minutes over just for the sake of, okay, we're going to have one more rep, or we're going to have, one or two more reps, because of the fact that, he wants to get Bo that extra rep, right? Or he wants to get Vele those extra reps, or he wants to get, some of those young bucks, or those young guns like ourselves, right? That's what we said at the top, like our young guns like ourselves. More practice. And speaking of training camp, one of the main topics, or the main course of this show, is we're going to be doing a deep dive in terms of the cornerback room and the defensive line. So we are going to be, doing a deep dive in terms of like that position group. How exactly can it make that defense better? And I really like the idea of getting the chance to talk about that, because I think that there is a way where even if the cornerback room doesn't change much, that defensive line, because of some of the additions that they made, could make that cornerback room that much better because of how good the defensive line is. So I'm really looking forward to having that kind of conversation. Mundungus asks, even if Bo and Stidham are even through training camp, you have to go with Bo, right? And I'll give it to you. I would say yes. I would absolutely say yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. At this point, you already know that Jarrett Stidham's not going to be your guy for the future. Bo Nix is the best chance out of those three quarterbacks to finally end this quarterback drought. So you are as patient with him as you possibly can, and you are operating throughout the entirety of camp that by the end of it, Bo Nix is going to be your guy up in Seattle week 1.
Yeah, and I think that whenever it is status quo, you have a tendency to probably lean maybe more to the player who gives you
the Jesus Christ. Sorry, my dog and my cat.
Fine. You're fine. The player who really gives you the highest ceiling, with that quarterback. So I really do think that, that's where it really would get you to bone. And of course, it's going to be repeated so often. We've said it numerous times with Glenn and Mundungus that, like, Bo Nix is his guy. Bo Nix is his guy, and so it's would be fair to say that if it is status quo, that's where it would tend. And actually, I would actually say that if it decides not to be Bo Nix, and that they continue to ride with Stidham, and and possibly obviously give some reps to Zach Wilson, but if they really continue to ride with Stidham, I would be just slightly concerned if I was a Bronco fan, for them not to give it to Bo Nix just yet.
Mm-hmm. And that's totally fair. If Bo Nix isn't ready, then you don't play him. But if he showcases that he can handle just the simple stuff, and I've said this many times, if he can handle the pre-snap operation, the cadence, just spitting the play out in the huddle, the pre and post snap identification of the reads. If he can handle all that stuff, then I'm perfectly comfortable letting him play. But if he's struggling with that stuff, if he just can't execute the operation, then I'm totally okay with letting him sit.
Yeah, 100%. So let's start things first. We'll jump back into our training camp frame of mind here in just a little bit. One of the moves that really kind of sent shockwaves a little bit with some of Broncos country is something that happened last week. And not to truly toot my own horn, but I will toot my horn on this, is that this is something that I called about a year ago, saying that I thought that this person was going to end up on the Broncos staff. I didn't exactly think it was going to be the front office, but he joined the Broncos in front office capacity. David Shaw is not rejoining his fellow Stanford compadre with the Los Angeles Chargers and Jim Harbaugh. He is actually going to be joining Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos, and fellow Stanfordite Condoleezza Rice, especially in the Denver Broncos front office. I tell you, Gage, the Broncos have really made it a priority, I feel like, in the last 12 months, given, or I should say really just the post Russell Wilson era, just nothing but shrewd moves. And I really feel like the hiring of Rager, especially the hiring of Jim Leonard, now you add David Shaw to this mix. Now, let's just take Leonard out of it just for a second, just add in Rager and Shaw. You really now have gotten to the point where the Broncos front office is far more cohesive than really it's been in quite some time.
Absolutely. And we were talking about this before we went live, how teams that have the most front office continuity are generally the ones that are going to build perennial championship contenders. The Kansas City Chiefs have had that same structure in place ever since 2013. And in that time frame, I think they've only missed the playoffs once. That goes to show just how well they are at like building the roster and adding depth and just being able to continually fill needs as players exit via free agency and retirements and all that stuff. Philadelphia Eagles, same thing. Those regimes have built perennial championship caliber teams in multiple different ways. The Philadelphia Eagles built a team around Carson Wentz, and then they built a team around Jalen Hurts. Howie Roseman has done such a phenomenal job of restocking the cupboard and filling his needs, a year beforehand. And that also goes to show the people around him, the people that helps him influence those decisions. And now George Payton has two really good influences in the building in Rager and Shaw, who can help him make some of these personnel decisions. And maybe it'll get to a point where those two can help cover up some of George Payton's flaws as a GM. And that might end up working in the benefit of the Broncos in terms of being able to build this perennial championship caliber team with all of these pieces in place, kind of giving their voice and giving their opinion. Specifically
from the player development side, because, if there's one thing that will always, absolutely always be such a huge beneficial part of that front office, is having so many different voices. And actually, this is maybe not a direction, that maybe Bronco fans wanted to necessarily go with in terms of talking about George Payton, but that, to his credit, was not necessarily in the building, when Sean Payton was there. Before Sean Payton was there, the Broncos front office wasn't exactly, that deep necessarily. And so now that there are people around George Payton, that will only make George better, and especially people within that front office better. And so now we will probably get the chance to actually see Payton truly operate in the way that he really needs to be, in the way that probably the Minnesota Vikings really started to view him as, which is really that second fiddle to to Rick Spielman. And I think that we're finally going to get a chance to see that maybe unfold with guys like David Shaw and Rager in the building. And so I think that, finally having that and it's really going to help that player development side. And so I really think, I really think, and I see you, Graham, and it's funny, I was just going to this, but like, I don't know, Gage, like the more things actually unfold this way, the more and more it's the opposite to me. Because as you just alluded to earlier, it's just about how cohesive the front office has been and how it's really important for that player development to still be intact for so many years. And even actually, to that credit, it's what makes those teams super valuable in the sense that if you want a general manager, you go look at those teams and you want to probably interview some of those candidates for much higher positions. And so that's what makes those types of front offices and people that you add to those front offices that much, more invaluable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, the main motivations behind George Payton potentially getting fired mostly surrounded him not being able to work with Sean. And during the course of the draft, I think it was pretty clearly established that those two are on the same page. They can work together and they can have similar visions about how they want to build this roster. Mm-hmm. So I feel like when you combine that with these moves, bringing in Cody Rager, bringing in David Shaw, that just showcases that they're trying to bolster this core around George Payton, and they're really trying to strengthen what he does well, and then maybe try to fill in some of the gaps and some of the flaws of his player personnel decisions. So I really feel like this overall spells that George Payton is in this for the long haul.
And if anybody wants to, talk about David Shaw strictly from a player developer side of things, I want to know where you're coming from. I really want to know where you're coming from, because the whole point of recruiting, high school recruiting, is about player development. I mean, it's about the head coach entrusting even some of his other staff members to go and find, some of those talent in other areas of the country, wherever it might be. It is all about that type of, coach and trusting all of that and then developing them and seeing a vision for them on your roster. And David Shaw, there may not have been a better succession plan in college football than what you saw at Stanford with Jim Harbaugh there, and then followed up by David Shaw. No, he didn't win any, national championships. And if that's something that you're going to be using as a evaluation of David Shaw and possibly why he's a really bad hire or a bad hire for the Broncos, I question your logic on that, because a good coach is a good coach. I mean, we actually had the opportunity to even talk with James Palmer a while back on Mainly Broncos before we actually joined MHRT, and like he even talked about how, David Shaw is so wildly respected in NFL circles. I mean, there is a reason why Shaw was a big voice and a big person that would be talked to on NFL draft day. I mean, like, he was one of my favorite pieces to listen to on the NFL draft, because you would get a chance to hear the other side of things and get a chance to hear that true player development side of like who he is as a player, who he is now. It's maybe to a certain degree, it's one of the reasons why maybe I really have enjoyed Kirk Herbstreit on Thursday Night Football, because he's really had that opportunity to see these players the majority of his time in college, and now he's gotten the chance to see possibly the finished product of what they've been in the NFL. So David Shaw is a true player evaluator, and I feel bad that it has taken me so long for me to realize that, maybe he would have been great on an actual staff, but his true vision, I feel like, is really that front office. I feel like, and having him be a part of the front office there. And I'll tell you what, Gage, I would not be surprised if he is a general manager at some point down the line with another football team.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe the only avenue I could see the Broncos maybe moving on from George Payton is if they are at risk of losing a guy like David Shaw, and they maybe feel like he's the driving force behind a lot of the positive personnel decisions that hopefully the team makes in the future. So that is one possible avenue if they really want to keep that in the building. But I totally agree. If it's not in Denver, I think it's going to be somewhere else for sure. He's doing all the right things to set himself up for a GM job in the NFL. Now he's just got to go and prove that he can do it.
There was a great follow-up tweet by Adam Schefter, and I gotta find it. It was about it was about David Shaw. Here we go. During David Shaw's 12 years as Stanford's head coach, he helped produce 42 NFL draft picks and 6 first-round selections, including Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Year Andrew Luck, Andrus Peat. Oh, should we say Sean Payton's, New Orleans Saint Andrus Peat, Joshua Garnett, Solomon Thomas, of course, Christian McCaffrey, and David DeCastro, all played under Shaw before becoming first-round draft picks. So, I mean, you don't really have to look all that far. Like, that is the essence. That is the essence of player development right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Being able to just continuously pump in high-quality NFL players, even not necessarily in the first round. Stanford has always been known to bring in at least 1 or 2 guys in each and every single draft, and a lot of those guys end up being starters because they're very smart players. You have to be smart if you're going to attend a school like Stanford, even on an academic scholarship. You have to be able to do it in the classroom, and that will translate in the NFL. Being able to just absorb information in meetings, absorb information just in the field on game day. That's really stuff that I think is invaluable when it comes to guys coming out of Stanford. And David Shaw was able to be a factory of those kind of players for 12 years. I think that goes very far in his ability to develop players.
And one of the underrated and less talked about things that we talked about Rager, we talked about, Sean, now we talked about that front office. Well, are we underselling and not talking a bit about maybe the role Condoleezza Rice is possibly having in this ownership group? I mean, you look at David Shaw, I mean, you don't want to compare it necessarily to, one of the reasons why Peyton Manning came to Denver was, because of John Elway and, something like that. And that was a reason, but it feels somewhat in the same vein like that, because like Condoleezza Rice and John Elway and the Stanford connection, like it feels rather big in the sense that, are we sort of underselling this idea of, how impactful Condoleezza Rice really is, with this ownership group? And, people give Rice a hard time, possibly, for, the political spectrum and what she had to deal with there. But she is about as knowledgeable a sports person as you will ever find. So I don't know about you, Gage, but I truly feel like maybe we're underselling possibly about Condoleezza Rice and, her role in the ownership.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's very clear that she's invested in what this team is trying to build, and bringing in guys that she has connections with, such as David Shaw, that could signal that she had some hand in it for sure. I think that I think that she's proven, based on her time on the College Football Playoff Committee. I saw an interview that she gave on the Manning Cast where she's very, very dedicated to the game of football and growing the game of football. I will say I do not agree with a lot of her political stances at all, but I think she's doing a really, really good job helping invest in this Denver Broncos organization, and that's all I can quite frankly ask for.
Yeah. And Rich, of course, yes, Pat Bowlen was the determining factor above all for Manning to come here. But we all know that there were some other reasons, some underrated reasons. And actually one being Todd Helton. And that's probably the comparison we probably should have made if we're going to be, comparing the Condoleezza Rice, possibly David Shaw type of connection would be the Todd Helton and, that kind of situation. But no, 100%. Pat Bowlen was a big driving force for why Manning, was a Bronco. Moving forward now and jumping back into the saddle of the training camp discussion, training camp deep dive of the defensive line and the defensive backs. Let's start first on the back end. Let's talk about those defensive backs. You and I have actually agreed with this in the sense of what things have been transpiring. And I think that the cornerback room we're looking at it maybe a bit wrong. I think we're maybe looking at it a bit wrong in the sense that maybe Riley Moss isn't necessarily competing for cornerback. Too, I do think he will get some significant playing time. Like I firmly believe he will be getting a fair amount of time. In that secondary, and I think you will see some strides with him in year 2. But I don't think he's cornerback 2, Gage. I think that there's a player, or better yet, maybe the best way to say this is, I think the Broncos have now afforded themselves a true versatile weapon in that defensive backfield with multiple different guys. One, of course, is an all-pro, under the radar all-pro in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be Jaquan McMillan, man. This dude is, at this point in time, I think we're envisioning his role, at least the general public is, maybe a little bit wrong. Based on what guys like Cecil Lammey and Andrew Mason, who have been out at camp, have indicated, Jaquan McMillan could be utilized on the outside. He could be utilized as the second boundary corner alongside Pat Surtain. I think that Jaquan were you going Pat Surtain or were you going Jaquan?
I was going Jaquan.
Okay, thank you. I was just making sure that we were on the same page as who the player was, because when you said crap all pro, I mean the under the radar, that should have meant Jaquan. Okay, we're good. I just had to make sure we were on the same page for the player here. I thought we were. But yeah, man, Jaquan's role could be very much as a hybrid player, both on the outside as well as in the nickel, but Riley could end up taking that spot as nickel. I know we've had those previous conversations about Riley being on the outside, Jaquan being at nickel. It could be the other way around. If you guys will remember, in camp last year, Jaquan was getting reps on the outside. He was basically going to enter the season as a backup boundary corner. Esain Bassey started the year at nickel. He had an absolutely disastrous game week 3 in Miami. He was one of the top culprits in 70-20. I'll just say that. He ended up getting cut right after that game. And that opened the door for Jaquan to start at nickel. And he ran with that job and produced really high-level play. I will say at the end of the year, there were some times, especially on deep balls, where we saw 29 trailing a little bit, and he gave up some completions. But I think that Jaquan has proven he's very hungry, and he's very versatile. That will go very far in the NFL. If he can get reps on the outside, he might be your long-term cornerback too.
Well, and I think that the way to probably look at this is exactly the way that maybe we, look at slot receivers. Because I think that a nickel corner or a slot corner is as valuable as a cornerback 2 as it is a slot receiver. And the greatest comparison of all of this would be like the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots made a living with Tom Brady, Wes Welker, Julian Edelman, you know, Chris Hogan for a period of time. Like they made a living. David Amendola, Danny Amendola, they made a living out of it with a slot receiver. And so I think that for a slot corner, I feel like you can actually look at it the same way now, to where I think that the versatility is a major weapon, and I think having two versatile weapons like that, or maybe even three versatile weapons. We'll get to that third here in just a little bit. Is just invaluable, and I think that for a guy like Riley, it's a nice transition for you because he didn't necessarily. To be completely fair, it seemed like that rookie year was a bit of a redshirt year. They didn't want to, run him in a bit much in terms of what they were wanting to offer, for him. But I think that with what you saw, just simply sparingly, it certainly seemed like he was handling himself quite well with what it was that he just never really just was given those opportunities. But I really do think that if you look at from what he is structurally and the defense that he's coming from with Iowa, I like the idea, and especially the Jim Leonard connection, because the Wisconsin-Iowa battles were running so strong, and Leonard is very familiar with Moss's game. So I would venture to guess, though, that like Moss, if he ends up being a nickel corner, will do fine there. I mean, when I'm saying fine, I'm not saying like he'll all of a sudden be a Pro Bowler. No, I think he'll be serviceable. He'll be good. I think he'll be solid. Will it be enough to get you over the top? That's really just going to be the ultimate, determining factor. But I think that having him there at that nickel corner, I think is really beneficial for him because it's a nice little ease into the process for him. But I also know that he's a highly intellectual player and then a intellectual corner. So I think that for him, I think it's a nice place for him to get that start. And we all know that Jaquan McMillan has 100% earned that right to be a cornerback too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. He really has taken his game and proven to the coaching staff that he has the ability to be a very impactful starter for this team. But kind of pivoting the conversation, absolutely, please do that. But pivoting the conversation back to Riley Moss a little bit, I really feel like he's also going to get battle tested in the slot, in the nickel, because he's going to be going up against some of the craftiest route runners in the NFL. So this is going to be a chance for him to almost get a baptism by fire. Last year was a year where it just felt like the Broncos didn't want to expose him to too much right away. I think Vance Joseph in particular learned a lesson about playing young corners with Isaac Yiadom. Isaac was a fourth round pick. What was it in 2018 under Vance Joseph? He got playing time in year one, and he had struggles. It was borderline disastrous at times, but Yiadom went on later in his career, and especially during his time these last couple of years with New Orleans, he's turned into a really damn good player. He always had that physical talent in him, but it felt like getting on the field too early in Denver was to his detriment rather than to his benefit. I think Vance Joseph was maybe thinking something similar here, and maybe he was one of the driving factors behind Riley Moss not playing, because I know Sean Payton is going to delegate a lot of defensive decisions to Vance Joseph. This could be the year where they want to ease Riley Moss in, and playing in the nickel is a good way to do that. And I think that Jaquan playing in the nickel last year is going to give him a lot of valuable tools that he can then translate to the outside. Maybe a similar thing could happen here with Riley Moss if they need to transition him at some point to the outside. But right now I'm looking at Jaquan being on the outside, Riley being on the inside.
And actually look at it this way. I this is something that just kind of dawned on me as you're talking about that. The last couple corners, that got, trial by fire, burned, if you will, by the Denver Broncos, Michael Ojemudia, and you hate to say his name. We'll talk about him in a little bit later, but Damari Mathis. I mean, it was a trial by fire for both of those corners. So the fact that we have this case where, no, he's really good, we believe in him, we're going to let the fans, make all sorts of narratives about, oh, they really don't believe in Riley Moss when they really do. But no, they're just going to take it easy with them. They're going to take it easy with them and just really ease him in. That's based on how the last quarterback, rooms have been with Mathis and Ojemudia. I love the patience approach that they've been going with Moss, because that alone will pay dividends for him long term. It's not a Drew Sanders situation necessarily, where it was to a certain degree almost a trial by fire a little bit with Drew Sanders. Riley was, no, we're just going to kind of wait and see a little bit. You're not injured, but I'm very curious to see how he will do. And we did sign Levi Wallace. And maybe, Graham, you're actually saying we should sign a vet. I don't think that they will. I think that they have enough pieces now within and they did with Levi Wallace. So I think they have enough pieces now into the room. Now, with it being a cornerback room, you can really never have too many corners. So I wouldn't, shy away from that. But going forward with some of those other options that are in that secondary, let's start first with the fresh in that cornerback room, and we talk about versatility. Let's talk about the law firm of Chris Abrams-Drain. I mean, he's a player that, I think he'll probably start out. A little bit, maybe in that dime backer role, something that you and I have been talking about before. I think he'll start out in terms of maybe, that fifth corner. The question is just going to be, what will that be at the end of the season? That's going to be the conversation for a guy like a Chris Abrams-Drain. If he's able to really understand, the responsibilities, the coverages, and he's really, that smart intellectual corner, you're going to see his name. You're going to see his name kind of rise a little bit in possible snaps and play time. And I would not be surprised. I'm not trying to say that he will take the place of Riley Moss, or he would take the place of, a guy like Levi Wallace per se, but I would not be surprised if come mid-season Levi Wallace ends up being expendable because of a guy like a Chris Abrams-Drain.
Yep. And Mike Kliss also noted that the Broncos have a vision for Chris Abrams-Drain actually on the outside. I do think he's going to get some snaps at dime backer, just because I think he's going to be so good in that role. But if he could potentially be an outside guy, he could basically be that third corner right off the bat, where if Pat Surtain or Jaquan McMillan, for all intents and purposes, were to go down, then Chris Abrams-Drain could step into that role, and he could really fill it quite admirably. One of the biggest compliments coming out of Missouri that he had from coaches was his intelligence. This dude was a film junkie. He was one of those first guy in, last guy out type of dudes. And that will, again, take you very far in the NFL if you know how to watch film, understand coverages, your zone assignments, where you have to be in a given time. That will, again, just help propel you into a potential starting role. The Broncos might not have a starting role for him right away, but I think he's going to see a lot of snaps this year, be it as that dime backer, because the Broncos ran a lot of dime last year. They're going to probably run a lot of dime again this year. That was one of the big factors behind that 5 game winning streak was some of those turnovers that they forced out of dime packages. I think that's going to continue. So Drain will have a role, but he has a chance this year to build on that and maybe make it an even bigger role than what we're envisioning right out the gate.
And let's face it too, the NFL is a very grueling season, and there will be injuries. There will be injuries at some point that will take. Hopefully, it's the same as what it was this last year with the Broncos. Thank you, Bo Lowry. But I think that with that secondary, they're going to need those options. They're going to need those options rolling in. And, having the Levi Wallaces at your disposal, that veteran, having a Chris Abrams-Drain, a Riley Moss, a Jaquan McMillan, having all those versatile, options at your disposal will just help you down the line. So if there is injuries and, players that need to come in, and spell time, they're at least capable enough to do so for at least a short period of time to fill the gap before player X, comes back from injury or something like that. So I think that I'll just say it this way. The depth at corner is better. I will say that. The depth at corner is definitely better based on where things stand now. Where it stands in terms of just the overall NFL, I would still say it's probably status quo because we haven't seen it. Like we haven't seen the actual product of what things have been like on the field. But I think the Broncos' potential with guys like Roddy Moss and Abrams-Drain, depending on how they will play, could significantly lift that room, with the play of J-Mac and PS2. If they're able to do that, then you are talking about a much, much better room. And, back to Moss for just a second, we'll probably talk about, the safety room here in a little bit in terms of maybe another episode, but don't count out Riley Moss possibly getting some, hybrid snaps at safety either. Another, like we said, he's a very highly intellectual player, so don't be surprised if he, kind of gets some looks there. I will say though, and I'll bring this back again, Mike Sanford, who is a CU Buffaloes coach. He does a show over on Altitude 92.5. He mentioned that Cooper DeJean is the most athletic corner. Cooper DeJean is the most athletic corner, but Riley Moss is the better corner. So keep that in mind. And from what Mike told me is that he coached against Riley. So again, keep that in mind. Now going on the inside and looking a little bit on that defensive line, let's start on the inside and work our way out. To those pass rushers. They did some beefing. They did some beefing up on that defensive line, and Malcolm Roach was an addition. Was an addition on that defensive line. The true law firm of Jonathan Franklin Myers was added to that defensive line. And a player that a lot of us thought was actually going to be released or cut was actually staying. And I think it actually is going to benefit him significantly with so many different bodies in that room. And they decided to roll and keep DJ Jones, at least for the moment. DJ Jones could be a cap casualty, certainly, as training camp and preseason certainly rolls around. But no, they decided to roll with DJ. And I think people have a tendency to kind of forget about how good he was in 2022. And it kind of gets lost in the sauce a little bit as far as 2023. And he didn't really have that great of a year, but it kind of gets lost.
It wasn't as bad as people want to paint it. I think it was a lot better than it was.
Yeah.
Than some people say it was.
But yeah, it definitely wasn't like just awful. It was absolutely awful to kind of what people are making it out to be. But I will say if you were to look at me and tell me or ask me who or what unit did the Broncos spend enough on where you actually feel like it flipped on a dime and you are the most comfortable with as a team? I actually would probably say the defensive line is probably the most comfortable with in terms of that defensive line, how good they can be, how deep of a unit that actually is now. And I'll just give it to you first because it was, and I know we said we're going to start on the inside, but the more I've been talking, it's just all juices are flowing at this point. But it really just starts with the addition of Jonathan Franklin Myers. The moment that trade happened and they added him to the mix, it's like everything just started to really fall into place with that defensive line and all the moves that they've had, or all the additions even that they already currently had on that defensive line.
Yep. But at the end of the day, the Broncos needed to generate more pressure from their defensive interior, and they needed to close more gaps in the run game. Franklin Myers on his own will help accomplish that. He's somebody that can consistently win his one-on-one matchups, and he got a lot of one-on-one matchups in New York with Quinnen Williams. He's probably going to still see quite a bit of one-on-one matchups here in Denver because you still have Zach Allen, you've got DJ Jones, and even double teams. He was able to face his double teams quite well, and the Jets used him a little bit on the edge as well. I think it's going to be a little bit less of that here in Denver just because Robert Saleh runs some different fronts than Vance Joseph does. But you never know. VJ could mix his game up there as well. And then when it comes to Malcolm Roach, he's another guy who has really, really flashed when he's gotten his opportunities. He didn't get a whole lot of opportunities. I want to say he played like 30% of defensive snaps or something low. I was shocked at how low that number was in New Orleans last year, but on tape, he definitely flashed. He was able to win consistently, especially against centers with some of his inside counter moves. I thought that he put up some really, really good reps, and he's going to be able to help, again, clog those gaps up front in the run game. And hopefully we won't see games like the Miami Dolphins game and the Detroit Lions game where they just ran the ball down our throats and we could do virtually nothing to stop it.
Yeah. And if you actually look at it from the Houston Texans point of view, a lot of people, myself included, were clowning the Texans over the years about, they're signing this player to a one-year deal. They're signing this player to a one-year deal. They're signing this player to a one-year deal. Not saying the Broncos did that, but one of the things that they were doing when they were signing some of those players to one-year deals was very quietly building the trenches. And when they built that trenches, it's really paid dividends for that defensive line. And now you're talking about almost an unstoppable defensive line that almost compares favorably to San Francisco now with how deep that defensive line is. And so the more you have been paying focus to that defensive line, the better overall that unit will be. And it's pretty obvious that unit the Broncos have is better than it really has been. And I really think that with Malcolm Roach, he actually ended up being talked about in the same conversation, in the same vein to a degree as DJ Jones. When DJ Jones signed with the Broncos in the offseason, he was graded out as the top run stopper in the entire NFL before he joined the Denver Broncos. Gage, who actually was one of the top run stuffers in 2023 before he signed with the Denver Broncos.
That would be Malcolm Roach.
That would be Malcolm Roach. So I think that if it all kind of gets to that point, like if all gets to that point for this Broncos team, I think you will finally get a chance to see a much more cohesive unit, because if there's one thing within there that they really struggled with in 2022 and even 2023 for that matter somewhat, was getting pressure from the inside. And because of that, it really impacted what they were able to do on the outside, and getting pressure from that outside with guys like Nick Bonito and Jonathan Cooper and Baron Browning. It really kind of hurt a lot of that, because a lot of those guys had to win their one-on-ones or win, a fair amount of their.
They couldn't set up stunts to save their life.
Exactly. And so I think that, for this, when you finally have more rotational parts and more solid, I should say solid pieces at your disposal now with Franklin Myers and Roach and Zach Allen, DJ Jones, you have more at that disposal there where you can actually do a lot of mismatching and working with on that defensive line, where I really think that you're going to get the chance to really see, I think, the pass rushers, and that's a nice little transition to the pass rushers where we might actually get the chance to see them, Baron Browning, Cooper, Benito, guys like Jonah Ellis really take shape and really kind of transform the defensive line as a whole.
Yep. And I'll just for that, Von Miller credits a lot of his career in Denver to Derek Wolfe, handling those double teams, picking up those stunts so that way he could loop back inside and be able to pick up the sack. You have an interior defensive line that struggles to generate pressure, your edge rush room is not going to be able to consistently eat. And again, that's what we saw for the last 2-3 years here in Denver because our interior defensive line has been so weak. We finally have some beef up there. We finally have guys like John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen. He was doing this last year as well, where he could kind of pick up some of those double teams on stunts, allowing the edge rushers to loop back inside, just little stuff like that. It really makes an edge rusher's job so much easier when they have a good defensive end next to them.
Yeah. So how does it impact some of those players that are on that pass rush side? I think it helps them significantly. And we touched on this. I'll just say this, is there a player within that defensive line, the Jonah Ellises, the Baron Brownings, the Jonathan Coopers, the Nick Benitos, is there a player within that and the defensive line that you feel has a tendency to really raise the ceiling up?
Right away on the edge, you have to look at Baron Browning. He's the highest ceiling edge rusher that the Denver Broncos have. He shows flashes of Von Miller at times just with his bend moves and some of his spin moves. He's extremely athletic. He's probably, I'd say Jonathan Cooper is probably the best run defending edge rusher that we have, but I'd also say that Browning's solid enough at it as well. So he's the guy that you immediately look towards in that edge rush room to really ascend and be that Batman amongst Robins. I think it's going to take a little bit more time with a guy such as Jonah Ellis. He probably is just going to need to learn the position at the NFL level and learn how some of these tackles are able to counter some of your moves, just little stuff like that. Nick Benito, he's somebody who's also primed to take his game to the next level. He had 9 sacks last year. He's somebody, especially just as a pure situational pass rusher, could really help take that next step forward in his game. But the guy that you immediately look towards is going to be Baron Browning for that.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that Baron Browning is your ceiling. Like Baron, if you're talking ceiling, he is that ceiling guy on that edge unit. And as far as the defensive line, who is the player that you feel like is the ceiling raiser of that defensive line?
JFM.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the fact that the Broncos were able to add such an impact player for a future 6th round pick, that's something that is going to go down as one of the most underrated moves of this entire offseason. He single-handedly raises the ceiling of that interior defensive line. And that's not to discredit Malcolm Roach. I think he does as well in his own right. But John Franklin Myers took a big-time weakness at defensive end because we were starting guys like Jonathan Harris there last year and turned it into one of the biggest strengths of the team.
I got to give a lot of credit to my Mainly Broncos co-host for this in terms of John Franklin Myers. And he said it this way. JFM will turn himself into, the player that they acquired for a 2026, draft pick from the New York Jets to a indispensable player on the Denver Broncos at the end of 2024. Like, and I think I'm right there with you because it's like he is going to be that type of player in terms of consistency, getting to the quarterback, creating so many pressures that they really have not had for quite a long time, and maybe quite a few years, where they've really have had those consistent pressures. And Myers, I really think, is going to really settle in nicely with what the Broncos are going to be wanting to do here. And so I very much feel like, he's going to end up being a fan favorite. He feels like he's already kind of trending in the direction of a fan favorite now with he and his son. But it really is starting to kind of trend in the direction that you are going to see some high quality play from the law firm of John Franklin Myers.
He's good when Jets fans were getting on Broncos Twitter and saying, like, congratulations, you guys got a good one.
Also, the Jets, they've got a really good defense, man. And so just to keep things, in terms of what we're talking about with John Franklin Myers, they acquired, he might have been maybe one of the more underrated pieces of that Jets defense, but probably don't want to tell some of those Jets defensive players that, because he felt like a really strong contributor, for that defense and for that defensive line. And so I was just mainly shocked that, one, they pulled that trade off, and two, it was a 2026, draft pick. And to make matters worse, look, if you're a Jets fan, and look, I talk ball with Scott Mason, who does, play like a Jet over there for the Jets. And Scott, if you are listening, I'm not trying to make matters even worse, but you traded us John Franklin Myers, and to make matters worse, Hassan Reddick has been a no-show in camp.
Oh, man. Gotta love the New York Jets, the NFL's comedy act.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm very curious to see how this is all going to, play out. And I probably, in terms of going back to the edge room, we'll probably talk about it a little bit, as we get closer, but it's at least worth asking the question now, Gage. But, and I'll give my thoughts on it after you say this, but if you had to predict because you said Browning is the ceiling in terms of the player for the edge room, but here's the question: will the Broncos have a 10-sack pass rusher this year?
Ooh. I mean, Nick Bonito was one away last year. Granted, it took a really, really big game against the Raiders to get there, but he could be the guy I'm looking towards just in terms of the sack production. But in terms of like the pressures and, run defense snaps and all that stuff, I look at some of the other guys, but just the sack numbers, I think Nick Bonito is the guy you look towards.
Yeah.
Because he may not win often, but when he wins, he wins.
And, it's one of the things that I've said it before. I think I've said it to you, is that it's like rebounding in basketball. When you are successful with your pass rush win rate, you're more than not going to be rather successful early on and in your career in the NFL. And Nick Bonito kind of feels like that guy, that is going to just win just purely off speed alone. And you just hope that, he's going to be able to create a little bit more to his arsenal. I will say it's hard having the conversation about ceiling because there's so many players that are just raw still to a degree that I feel like, if Bonito just adds just a little bit more to his room in terms of like being a run defender and adding just a little bit more, to his arsenal as a pass rusher, he really could be a top 12 pass rusher in the NFL. Like, that's the kind of talent that he has. And
he's an athletic freak.
And Baron Browning, if he is just healthy and able to consistently get 12 to 15 sacks a year, he's arguably a top 12 to top 15, pass rusher. And then Mr. Consistency over there, Mr. Tim Patrick of the edge room, Jonathan Cooper, if he can consistently be able to churn out and be a solid run defender and maybe even get those 15 sacks, like an Everson Griffith, like that, I feel like that's his highest ceiling for me is like the Everson Griffith, type of player for Cooper. If he can get to that point, he's definitely a top, 12, top 15 edge rusher. So it's such a weird room when you look at it. And then of course there's Jonah Ellis, who's maybe a little bit more in his bag, right? A little bit more in his bag than Nick Benito. And if it hits for him more than a guy like Benito, you might want to start looking at, Ellis a little bit more, maybe instead of Benito, based solely off of what he has in his bag. But it's such a fun conversation. I will say that they won't, but they will have a 10 sack player on this team,
and that'd be John Franklin Myers.
It would be John Franklin Myers.
Oh my God, I'm here for it. I'm so here for it.
So you heard it here first, MHRT Network listeners, that John Franklin Myers will have 10 plus sacks in 2024. Any other final thoughts? As we're kind of winding down the show, and people that are in the chat right now, feel free to chime in. But Gage, any final thoughts?
I will say, just being able to generate interior pressure, I think that is even more impactful than generating edge pressure, because if you're able to generate interior pressure, the quarterback cannot step up into the pocket, and more often than not, he's going to run into a sack from one of the edge rushers. So we could see our edge rushers' sack numbers go up just by the sheer factor of having somebody like John Franklin Myers get right in the face of the quarterback, and then Nick Benito's there to clean it up. I think that's something that we could see quite a bit next year, and I'm totally here for it.
Wait, you're already on the next year? You're already on the 2025?
Or, I mean, okay, this you know what I mean, dude.
But no, yeah, I think it's especially, and you hate to live in the past, but when you're a Nebraska fan, it's really easy to live in the past. But like, it's one of the things that made the 2015 Broncos defense so electric, because, or specifically that Packers game. Like, if you look at 2015, because like one of the things I remember vividly was them wanting to keep Aaron Rodgers within the pocket, and they did. And when they did, the pocket collapsed on him, and it was arguably one of the worst performances of his entire career, in the NFL. I'm sure he would probably be even on record saying that was probably one of the worst performances, of his life. And I mean, if you're able to make a quarterback's life a living hell in the pocket on a consistent basis, you're doing something right. And when you're doing something right, that means you're getting sacks, you're getting pressures, you're getting QB hits. I mean, you're getting all of that, in terms of your defensive line, which is, oh, by the way, I didn't say just sacks, people, like, because sacks is a glorified, stat. It goes beyond sacks, right? That's right. But I'm very much looking forward to the Broncos defensive line with what they can be able to put out there. And of course the defensive backs. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about the safety room, the inside linebackers, and we'll get to probably the exciting situations and probably the exciting stuff to talk about, which would be, of course, the quarterback position. And my guess is that might be a little bit more as training camp gets closer, to get you guys excited for training camp and get a chance to talk about Bo Nix. But for Gage, myself, it's been a fantastic show of the 5280 podcast. Make sure you follow Gage in the shows and the show that he does over with the Broncos Syndicate. I will be doing a show tomorrow. We also will be back tomorrow. Mainly Broncos will be back on Wednesday at 7:30. And join us next week for another episode of the 5280 podcast, where hopefully the gang will finally be back.
Fast lane when I pass in the street, bag of money in the passenger seat. Simcoe's been asking for me on the road from the west to the east. Way up, I might never come down, cause the coast's racking up the flight miles. So high, might never come down. So what? This is my lifestyle. Wait a minute.